The last video of this series is going to spend time discussing the fighting of the war very briefly, why the war ended, and different diplomatic efforts during the war. The fighting of World War II was waged on two fronts, or theaters of operation. In the Pacific, Japanese forces reached the height of their power in 1942, occupying islands throughout the western Pacific Ocean. In Europe, much of the fighting in the first year of war was between the Germans and the Soviets, as the latter fought desperately to prevent the conquest of the Soviet Union. The high tide of the German advance had ended in 1942, partly as a result of the U.S. entry into the war, but mainly because of a Soviet victory at Stalingrad in the winter of that same year. Just a little aside, there's an interesting movie called Enemy at the Gates, which is about two historically interesting figures in Stalingrad, but it is a loose interpretation because pretty much everybody in there is British or American that's acting, so just pay no attention to those accents. And again, that's not to say that, right, the German advancement or the German power does start to shift in 1942, but it's going to be another 3 years until the war is over. So this is not, it's a change in Germany's advance, but it is not the end by any means. Coordinating their military strategy, the British and Americans concentrated on two objectives in 1942. The first was overcoming the menace of German submarines in the Atlantic, and the second was beginning bombing raids on German cities. U.S. bombers carried out daylight strategic bombing raids on military targets in Europe, but the lines between military and civilian targets became blurred as the war carried on, especially in Japan, but I'll talk about that in a second. We see a new strategy emerge with the advancement of military technology during World War II. Or rather, I should say this is an older strategy, but it's carried out in a new way. This strategy was first discussed when we talked about the Civil War, and it's that of annihilation through attrition. And you'll recall that this is when the objective is not only to just win a decisive battle, but to make the lives of your opponents so miserable that they will want to surrender, because gone are the days of decisive battle wars. In the Civil War, this meant cutting off supply lines, blockading a town, and destroying crops, as well as bombarding cities. But in World War II, this is employed through the use of carpet bombing. Carpet bombing is when a series of planes fly over a civilian populated area and basically drop a bunch of bombs. So they blanket or carpet they toss a carpet of bombs over the city. This is different. Carpet or saturated bombing is different than strategic bombing, because strategic bombing tries to eradicate military targets or supply or communication stations, and carpet bombing is mainly centered at civilian targets. Probably the most deadly attack on a city was that of Dresden in Germany. Over a period of 3 days in 1945, U.S. and British forces dropped more than 3,900 tons of explosives on the city, leading to the deaths of 25,000 people. 25,000 people dead in a period of 3 days. Okay, so in terms of battles, this is really only a few things are going to be highlighted. This was a war that lasted several years. There are a lot of significant battles. There are many turning points, so this is really just a brief overview, very, very brief overview on the fighting. The Allied drive to liberate France began on June 6, 1944, with the largest invasion by sea in history. On D-Day, as the invasion date was called, British, Canadian, and U.S. forces under the command of General Eisenhower secured several beachheads on the Normandy coast in France. After this bloody but successful attack, the Allied offensive moved rapidly to roll back German occupying forces and hopefully to push into Germany. By the end of August, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied troops had crossed the German border for a final push towards Berlin. The Germans launched a desperate counterattack in Belgium in December of 1944, but after this setback, Americans reorganized and resumed their advance. Meanwhile, the Soviets are continuing to push, trying to push into Germany on that side of Europe as well. Probably the two most famous, and I personally think best depictions of the soldiers' experience during a time of war in World War II in the European theater is that of Saving Private Ryan, which has an extremely gruesome first 20 or 30 minutes of the film that is depicting the D-Day invasion and what, as close as you can in a movie, what it was like to be on the beach on that day. The other visual depiction would be the mini-series Band of Brothers, which is about the 101st Airborne Division. It's a pretty fascinating series. If you have the time to watch it, I highly recommend both of them. Since 1942, Allied bombing raids over Germany had reduced the nation's industrial capacity and therefore their ability to continue fighting. Recognizing that the end was near as the Soviet army was closing in on Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. The unconditional surrender of the Nazi army took place a week later on May 7th. As U.S. troops advanced through Germany, they came up, U.S. and Soviet troops, by the way, it's not just U.S. troops, they came upon German concentration camps and witnessed the horrifying extent of the Nazi program of genocide against the Jews and other considered undesirables. And many people don't know this, but Jewish people were not the only people that were targeted by the Nazis. Anything that was considered like sub-Aryan became a target. So homosexuals, members of the Catholic clergy, political dissidents, academics, Soviet, Polish, Yugoslavian civilians, or Yugoslav civilians, Jehovah's Witnesses, socialists, trade union workers, the mentally and physically disabled, Soviet prisoners of war, and Roma people were also exterminated, essentially, according to Nazi policy. I'm not in any way trying to glance over the Holocaust, but this is a topic that we aren't going to discuss in this video. It is a topic that was heavily covered last year, and we will also spend time in class discussing this as well. So the fact that it's not here should not be indicative that it is not important, because it is. But we will talk about that at another time. On the Pacific front, so in Europe, British, Soviet, and U.S. forces were jointly responsible for defeating Germany. But in the Pacific, it was largely the U.S. armed forces that challenged the Japanese. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan seized control of much of East Asia and South Asia. By nearly 1942, or by early 1942, Japanese troops occupied Korea, Eastern China, the Philippines, British Burma and Malaya, French Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and most of the Pacific Islands west of the Midway Island. So this is an extreme, they had expanded quite quickly. The war on the Pacific was dominated by naval forces battling over a vast area. Intercepting and decoding Japanese messages enabled U.S. forces to destroy Japanese carriers and 300 planes in the decisive Battle of Midway on June 4th to 7th. And this battle was the turning point in Japanese expansion. After the victory of Midway, the U.S. began a long campaign to try to get within striking distance of Japan's home islands by seizing strategic locations in the Pacific. Using this strategy, called island hopping, hopping from one island to the next in order to try to get closer to Japan, commanders bypassed strongly held Japanese posts and isolating that with naval and air power. Allied forces moved steadily toward Japan. I do want to talk really quickly, also remind you that carpet bombing was also employed in the Pacific campaign as well. I want to mention a little bit about Japanese soldier mentality during this time period. The concept of the Bushido Code had revived during this very nationalistic Japanese time period, especially pre-World War II and the events leading up to World War II. And the Bushido Code is that of, it's the code of honor followed by the samurai, the ancient Japanese warriors. And one of the key components of the Bushido Code is the complete disregard for the concept of surrender. That to surrender is basically like to say it's unworthy is an understatement, but that any soldier would rather commit suicide, would rather fall upon their sword, okay, than surrender to an enemy. And that also dying in battle was an honorable death. And to live a soldier's life, that would be the death that one would hope for. And so we see during this time period Japanese using kamikaze pilots, which are basically suicide pilots that would fly these missions that would intentionally crash their planes into strategic locations. I want you to think about what it would mean to fight an opponent that does not believe in surrender. Okay, and it led to a very difficult experience in the Pacific campaign. If you want to learn more about what that soldier's experience was, I think the mini-series The Pacific, which talks about several major battles, or it's like Band of Brothers, but in the Pacific. It does a very good job of highlighting really the horrors and of fighting such a battle. Okay, so the one battle besides Midway, that I'm going to highlight is the Battle of Okinawa. This was an 82-day long battle that lasted from the 1st of April until the 22nd of June in 1945. After a long campaign of island hopping, the Allies were approaching Japan and planned to use Okinawa, which was a large island only 340 miles away from mainland Japan, as a base for air operations on the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. The battle had been referred to as the Typhoon of Steel in English. This nickname refers to the ferocity of the fighting, the intensity of the kamikaze attacks from the Japanese defenders, and to the sheer numbers of Allied ships and armored vehicles that assaulted the island. The battle was one of the bloodiest in the Pacific. The Allied forces suffered 14,000 deaths, with an estimated total of more than 82,000 casualties of all kinds, so including injuries, not just deaths. This does not include several thousand who succumbed to their injuries that they received during battle and died several months or even days later. Based on Okinawan government resources, Japan admittedly lost 77,166 soldiers. And this number does not include civilians and the supporting naval or air forces that were based elsewhere. No figures are given for supporting Japanese forces killed. Allied grave registration for forces counted 110,071 dead bodies. Simultaneously, some 42 to 150,000 local civilians. This was including all male citizens over 18 and both male and female students under age 18 who were drafted to fight the invaders. That number is a number of civilians who were killed or committed suicide or went missing, a significant portion of the estimated pre-war 300,000 local population. So again, 42 to 150,000 local civilians killed, committed suicide, went missing out of 300,000, so almost potentially half of a population of the locals. The severity of this campaign, along with the many civilians fighting, led to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, together with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, caused Japan to surrender less than 2 months after the end of the fighting in Okinawa. So it's the Battle of Okinawa that really begins to shift American military strategy away from the idea that an invasion of Japan is smart. So let's talk about those decisions to drop the atomic bomb. After Okinawa, a huge invasion force stood ready to attack Japan. But again, extremely heavy casualties were feared. By this time, the United States had developed a frightfully destructive new weapon. The top secret Manhattan Project had begun in 1942, directed by the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The project employed over 100,000 people and spent $2 billion to develop a weapon whose power came from splitting of the atom. The atomic bomb, or A-bomb, was successfully tested on July 16, 1945 in New Mexico. So if you're ever at a trivia game and somebody asks where the first atomic bomb was dropped, the answer is not Hiroshima. The answer would be New Mexico. But most people tend to put the bombing of Hiroshima as the first atomic bomb. Just a little aside for you. Okay. Probably nothing is more controversial in World War II when studying World War II than the idea of Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. There are multiple interpretations regarding this subject. I'm going to briefly kind of glance over these. This is still a subject that is hotly contested in America as well as outside. On the 50th, just to give you an example, on the 50th anniversary of the bomb, the Smithsonian, which is a national history museum in Washington, D.C., wanted to display these multiple perspectives that I'm going to talk about here, but ultimately had to scale it back because it was considered too controversial. So you can see that this is something that still is a debated topic among historians as well as members of particularly American and Japanese society. So it makes sense that this topic should receive so much attention because the world completely changed with this decision in ways that surely no one person could ever have predicted. So here's a brief overview of the most common interpretations. The traditionalist interpretation is this. Truman's decision to drop the bomb was done in order to prevent the high loss of American lives that would have happened if the United States was forced to invade Japan. So Truman reluctantly agreed to use this weapon on Japan to prevent American casualties. A revisionist historian goes like this. Truman knew that Japan was close to surrendering, but was worried that they would surrender to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had promised to enter the war. And so Truman decides to drop the bomb not to prevent American casualties, but as a sign to Stalin to show the United States' power and to get the U.S. or to get Japan to completely surrender to the Americans and not the Soviets. Okay, and if the Japanese surrender to the Americans, then the Americans will have influence in the rebuilding of Japan, as opposed to the Soviets. There's another mixed interpretation that while Truman did decide to drop the bomb in order to prevent American deaths, that this decision was hasty and ultimately unnecessary, and it led to consequences that were far worse. So these are just three different perspectives on Truman's decision to drop the bomb. But we do know, of course, that Truman did decide to drop the atomic bomb. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped at Nagasaki. About 250,000 Japanese died, either immediately or after a prolonged period of suffering as a result of the two bombs. On the left here, you can see a picture of the decimated area of Nagasaki. On the upper right is a picture of the fuselage of the Enola Gay, which was one of the bombing airplanes in this campaign. And below that is the iconic now mushroom cloud over Nagasaki. Within a week after the second bomb fell, Japan agreed to surrender if the Allies would allow Japan to remain within a week of the second bomb, Japan agreed to surrender if the U.S. would allow their powerless head of state to remain. General MacArthur received Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd, 1945, in Tokyo Harbor aboard the battleship Missouri. So that's the end of the war in the Pacific. So this has happened, there are several things kind of happening all at the same time. The president, FDR, had died after he had returned from a conference at Yalta, which I'm going to talk about in a second here. And when he returned from this conference, it was apparent that his health had significantly deteriorated. And on April 2nd, 1945, while resting in a vacation home in Georgia, An exhausted Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly. News of his death shocked the nation almost as much as Pearl Harbor. Harry S. Truman, of course, his vice president, enters the presidency unexpectedly and assumes an enormous responsibility as commander-in-chief of a war that had not yet been won. So again, FDR passes away in April, and the United States is not going to declare victory in either campaign for another several months. Okay. I want to shift again here to wartime diplomacy efforts within the Allied countries. So during the war, the big three leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain arranged to confer secretly to coordinate their military strategies and to lay the foundation for peace terms and post-war involvement. So the first of these was at Casablanca, and it involved only two of the big three. In January of 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to a grand strategy to win the war. So how was this war going to be fought? The plans for this included invading Sicily and Italy, and a plan to demand unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. In Tehran, the big three met for the first time in November of 1943, and they agreed that Great Britain and America would begin their drive to liberate France in the spring of 1944, and that the Soviets would invade Germany from their end, and eventually they would join the war against Japan. In Yalta, which was a resort town on the Black Sea coast of the Soviet Union, in February 1945, the big three meet again for the last time. Their agreement at Yalta would prove to be prove the most historic of the three meetings. After victory in Europe was achieved, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed to the following. Okay, so this is their plan for after the war. 1, Germany would be divided into occupation zones. Clearly, they cannot continue to have their government. So that means that they're going to be in a state of martial law imposed by the Allies until Germany can get up and running. That there would be two, there would be free elections in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe, which was interesting because Soviet Union troops controlled this territory. 3, the Soviets would enter the war against Japan, which they did on August 8th of 1945, just as Japan was about to surrender. 4, the Soviets would control the southern half of the Sakhalin Islands and the Kuril Islands, my apologies if I pronounce those incorrectly, in the Pacific, and would have special concessions in Manchuria. And the last of the agreements is that a new world peace organization, which would be the future United Nations, would be formed at a conference in San Francisco. So these, even though the war had not ended, this was the big three's plan for what was going to happen when the war did end. The war in Europe ended. In late July, after Germany's surrender, only Stalin remained as one of the big three. Truman was the U.S. president, and Clement Attlee had just been elected the new British prime minister. The three leaders met in Potsdam, Germany from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, and they agreed to demand that Japan surrender unconditionally, and that they were also going to hold war crime trials of the Nazi leaders. That may not seem like a significant decision, but the big three had debated for quite some time about what they were going to do with the Nazi leaders when they defeated Germany. And there were several suggestions of just summarily executing them. To what extent those were made as jokes, even though it's not really that funny, was a bit questionable in historical records. But we do know that this was something that they were talking about. Hey, we're going to come in here. We're going to take over Germany. They can't keep their government. What are we going to do with the people who were leading this government? Not only the war effort, but also what happened to the civilians as well. So at Potsdam, they agree to hold trials for that. And these trials were held in Nuremberg. Sorry, I wrote on this slide that the trial for war crimes was new. It's not completely new. The precedent had been established actually in World War I, at the end of World War I. This was certainly done on a much larger and more publicized scale, though. And these trials were held in Nuremberg, Germany. And the location for Nuremberg was specifically chosen. One, it was a huge building, so it would be able to house so many officials and lawyers and reporters. But it was also the heart of Nazi propaganda. The Nazi leaders would hold these giant rallies at Nuremberg, and it was also the location of the writing of the Nuremberg laws, which were the laws that were passed limiting civil liberties of Jewish citizens at the start and towards the end of the war, at the start of the war. The most destructive war in the history of the world had a profound effect on all nations, including the United States. The deadliest war in human history resulted in the death of some 50 million military personnel and civilians worldwide. Excluding the Civil War, of course, where Americans fought Americans, more Americans died in World War II than in all other U.S. wars combined. The war left the country with a huge national debt, but domestically, the U.S. suffered very little compared to others. Unlike the rejection of the League of Nations following World War I, Congress readily accepted the peacekeeping organization that was conceived during World War II and put it in place immediately after the war. Meeting in 1944 near Washington, D.C., Allied representatives from the U.S., the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China proposed an international organization to be called the United Nations. Then, in April 1945, delegates from 50 nations assembled in San Francisco, where they took only 8 weeks to draft a charter for the United Nations. The Senate quickly voted to accept U.S. involvement in the United Nations. And on October 24, 1945, the UN came into existence when the majority of its member nations ratified the charter. In a final speech, which he never delivered, Franklin Roosevelt wrote, "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be the doubts of today." There would be doubts, to be sure, about the new world order to emerge from World War II. At least initially, though, there was also widely shared hopes that life would be better and more prosperous after the war than before. While other combatants like China, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union had suffered extensive damage from the war, the cities of the United States had remained unscarred. So they had their infrastructure intact, and in fact had only improved upon their infrastructure as wartime measures during World War II. Without a doubt, the United States in 1945 was one of the most prosperous and most powerful nations in the world. It had played a major role in defeating the fascist dictators. And now people looked forward with some optimism to both a more peaceful and a more democratic world. Unfortunately, the legacy of this war and the decisions made during this war and after this war will carry on into the rest of the 21st century. So concludes our discussion of World War II.